Hello learners, welcome to the MOOC course on Digital Humanities Theory and Practice. So we now move on to the third topics in the Digital Humanities Theory and Practice session, which is Digital Scholarship and Practices. So far we focused on finding things, search strategies, academic databases. Now we shift to a related question. Once we have found material, what does it actually mean to do scholarly work with them digitally, right? So we'll look at how digital humanities projects are structured, the standards and the platform that support digital scholarship, and the practical decision every researcher has to make when starting a digital project. So we will discuss in this lecture the digital scholarships and the practices as I said earlier. Now here's the roadmap for today. We'll start by defining what digital scholarship actually mean. Then break down the basic structure that every digital humanities project shares: material, processing, and presentation. From there, we will walk through how a research question turns into an actual digital workflow, using two real examples so it doesn't stay abstract. We'll spend real time on ethical questions that come up along the way because these matters as much as the technical steps. Then we'll move into the standard and platform things like LinkedIn, Open Data, IIF, and GitHub that make digital scholarship shareable and built to last. We'll close with the project design and a set of best practices that you can actually apply. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to look at digital humanities, any digital humanities project, and explain how it was built and why it was built that way. Alright, so this is how we are going to do throughout this session. Now, defining digital scholarship and digital practices. Now, let us start with the definition you should hold on for the rest of this unit. Digital humanities work happens at the intersection of the computational methods and the humanities material. Now, look at the slide. That's deliberately broad because it has to cover everything from text analysis to mapping to the 3D modeling, all under one umbrella. Now, look at the second point. Your material might start on analog, a manuscript and a photograph, a field recording, or they might be born digital, created digitally from the start. Either way, every decision you make about how you digitize and process them shapes what kind of a research is even possible afterward. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it means your technical choices early on are already intellectual choices. Now, the third and the fourth digital tradition humanities methods are complementary. The third and the fourth point that push back against a common misconception. Some students assume digital tools are a shortcut around the hard intellectual work of humanity researchers. They are not. Notice the wording on the slide. Digital scholarship is driven by intellectual question, and digital methods cannot replace close reading, and many more than the data mining can replace actually reading a text. The technology changes how you pursue a question. It doesn't replace having a good question in the first place. And the final point reinforces this. The strongest digital humanities work always comes from the scholar we know their field deeply, not from the people who simply know how to operate a tool. Now, this slide, the structure of the digital humanities project. This slide will give you a structure. I want you to genuinely memorize because you will use it constantly. Materials, processing, and the presentations. Look at how the slide breaks into each one down, right? So materials are whatever you're starting with, images, text, maps, 3D models, sound files, anything central to your research, processing is what you do to those material computationally. Thinking or things like data mining or statistical analysis. And lastly, the presentation. The presentation is how you share the outcome, often as a website, sometimes offline, depending on your audience and your goals. So here's why this matter as a habit. Whenever you encounter any digital humanities project from now on in this course or anywhere else, you can ask three simple questions. What material is this built on? What processing happened to them? And how are the results being presented? That's genuinely useful diagnostic tool. So I hope this is clear. Materials basically means the images, the maps, the three-dimensional models, sound, media files, and or any combination of these central to these research projects. Processing are subjected to computational methods such as data mining or the statistical analysis, as we discussed earlier. And lastly, your presentation, whose outcomes are organized for an audience, often web-based, sometimes offline, depending on the project's needs and the goals. Now look at the last bullet, or look at the last point. Researcher also speak of the backend, files, databases, serve, processing, programs, and the front end, the user-facing experience of a digital project. All right. So I want you to look at the last point, the backend and the front end distinction. Now the backend is everything happens under the hood or database, the code, the processing, script. The front end is what a user actually sees and polished website or nice looking visualization, or assuming that where all the work happened. Actually, the real intellectual decision usually happen earlier, which is or in how the materials were processed. Keeping that in mind as we move forward. Now this slide, from research question to digital methods. Now this slide is essentially a practical checklist, and I want you to notice what it does not start with. It doesn't start with pick a tool. Look at the first point. You begin with a question and a collection of material. That's it. Only after that do digital methods even enter the picture. All right. So walk through the checklist on the slide with me. First, define your research question. Define your research question clearly. Second list, what material you actually have to access and in what format they currently exist. Third, this is something which students generally skip. Access the intellectual property, privacy, and the ethical use of those materials before you do anything else with them. Now, this is very important because we don't actually consider the ethical use. Students generally skip these parts, right? Ethical uses are very important and prominent when it comes to these things, when it comes to digital methods, because everything is there in a spur of moment, just a click away. So we do not bother ourselves, or students do not bother ourselves to think about these things, but these are very serious, right? So what I would like to say again, and I would like to repeat that access the intellectual material, privacy, and the ethical use of those material before you do anything else with them. Now look at the third point, the quantitative versus qualitative distinction. Some research questions are best answered by counting things, word frequency, date location on a map. Other require interpretive judgment that's much harder to standardize, things like tone, mood, and moral framing. Knowing which kind of a question you're actually asking shapes every decision that follows it. So the last point is just good project management. Or practical planning steps include consulting institutional technical support, identifying which tasks require outside attendance, and developing a realistic work plan, budget, and the timeline. So the last point that I just read out is just a good management project. All right. Talk to the technical support if your institution has it. Figure out honestly what you can do yourself versus what needs help, and build a realistic timeline and budget. Skipping this step is one of the most common reasons digital humanities project stall out. So one has to keep this thing in mind. Now, workflow in practice, how digital scholarship actually unfolds. Now, let's make the workflow concrete with two real examples, because this can feel the abstract otherwise. Look at the stages listed at the top. Find material, check rights and ethics, organize the data, process it, present the results. Now that's general shape. Now here is what it actually looks like in practice. For the first example, imagine studying how gender shape the way crimes and punishment are described in old ballads. That's not just make a chart. Before you can chart anything, you have to decide how you'll define gender and moral judgment within your data itself. And the decision is generally interpretive, not just technical. You're making a scholarly judgment call before you ever touch a spreadsheet. The second example is studying bias in an old museum catalog records. Here, you would analyze the actual language used in those catalog entries to spot patterns, and importantly, think about whose voice is represented and who is missing from the record. Now, look at the fourth point. Now, while you look at this one, I want you to emphasize this because it's an honest, sometimes overlooked truth. Not every research question needs a digital approach. Sometimes the labor involved or the ethical complexity genuinely outweighs what you would gain. Recognizing that is itself good scholarly judgment, not a failure. And finally, always document the choices you made while processing your data, not just the final result, because in digital humanities, those choices are a part of the scholarly contribution. Now, ethical consideration in digital practices or practice. I don't want you to treat the slide as a slide note tagged on to the lecture, right? So look at the first point here. Digital tools speed up our research, but the choices built into them, what counts as data, what gets included or excluded, can carry hidden biases. Now that biases exist even when the tool looks neutral and efficient. Maybe especially then, because the biases is invisible. Because the bias is invisible. Now the second point, these issues connect to the wider concern about exclusion in how materials get digitized and represented, raised especially in the critical race studies. Now, second point connects this to a bigger conversation. These issues these issues link to broader concern about exclusion, who gets represented and who gets left out, and that conversation has been raised especially within critical race studies. Now the next is, cultural materials may still belong in a meaningful sense to the communities they came from. Ownership questions don't disappear just because something was acquired long ago. And the next one says, work with private or sensitive recordings raises a real question of consent and permission that must be resolved before you start processing. Now look at this third and the fourth one. Now the third point and the fourth point, because these are the ones with real practical weights. If you're working with a cultural material, ownership questions don't disappear just because something was acquired decades ago or the centuries ago. Communities may still have a meaningful claim to material connected to heritage. And if you're working with a private or a sensitive recordings, you need to resolve the consent and the permission questions before you start processing, not after. And last point says, make your tools hidden choice visible. Explain them in your project documentation rather than leaving unexamined. Now, the final point is your action item, right? So, make your tools hidden, choices visible. So, tools are hidden, choices are visible. Explain them in your project documentation rather than leaving them unexamined. Now, my advice for you, plan your own future projects. Build this kind of a ethical reflection in your in from the very first planning stage, not as final checklist. Once the final checklist item, once the technical work is already done. All right. So next is the network resources standard and the interoperability. Now let me unpack this slide with a simple example, because the terminology can sound more complicated than the idea actually is. You must have noticed or you must have witnessed many of the teachers who generally come to teach us, or not just teachers, but some scholars or some thinkers. Sometimes what they do is they talk in a very jargonish language. They talk with registers. So sometimes what happens, this type of a terminology, this type of register or the jargonish language becomes very complicated than the idea itself is. All right. So yes, so we should avoid such things. So as I said that the terminology can sound more complicated than the idea actually is. So look at the first point here. It says resources, services, platforms, three different things. Resources hold the shareable assets, service support online, project work, platform gives you a ready-made framework to work in. Now look at the first point. Resources, services, platform are the three different things. All right, and yes, and resources hold shareable assets, services support online, project work, platform gives you a ready-made framework to work in. So now the operability or interoperability point. Imagine a museum in New York and a museum in Seoul, each catalog their collection, but using completely different terms and system. Without some shared standard, you could never search both collections together, right? So they simply wouldn't speak the same language. That's exactly the problem interoperability is built to solve, right? And linked the open data using a standard called RDF, which is one major approach to solving it. It makes information machine readable across totally different repositories. Look at the fourth point for the concrete sense of this action, of this in action. Consortia like NINDS for the 19th century studies and Pelagios for the Asian geography exist specifically because separate scholarly projects used to be built in isolation and couldn't share the data with each other. These consortia will build to fix it. Now, one last thing on the final point here. Standard only work if everyone applies them consistently, and fixing old inconsistent data to match a new standard is slow and genuinely expensive. Now, you don't need to become a metadata specialist. Just remember why these standards exist and what problem they solve. The platform and frameworks for digital scholarship. Now, again, you don't need to memorize every acronym on this slide, like IAF, SciDoc, CRM, GitHub. You don't have to remember. What matters is recognizing these serious digital scholarship usually relies on the shared framework rather than one-off custom solution built from scratch. Look at the IIIF. or yeah, specifically, because it solves a problem you have probably experienced without naming it. Thinking about a random image you find through a search engine, it often comes stripped of context, no source, no dimensions, no information about who made it or where it is from. Now, materials accessed through the framework like IIIF retain all of that information, which is exactly why the slide calls it a strong professional standard for digital scholarship. Now, SciDoc CRM. Now, SciDoc CRM does something similar, but specifically for the cultural heritage metadata. And GitHub, which you may have already heard of even outside this course, is a repository for sharing and version controlling programming code. It lets multiple people work on the same project independently and merge their updates later without conflict. Now, the last point that we have in this slide or on this slide is generally practical advice for your own future work. Choosing a platform involves a trade-off between simplicity of use and how customizable it is. And before you commit your research to any platform, always check whether it has an export function. Building your work directly on a platform into a platform you can't later move your data out of is a real risk of your own labor. Don't learn that lesson the hard way. Now, project design and sustainability. Now, this slide is about a question I want you to ask honestly before starting any digital project. Look at the first point here. The very first point, the very first consideration should be the fit between your own expertise and what project actually needs. So think about this. Think about this very seriously. Now look at the second point that we have here. This is the real gut check question. Will digital method let you ask a genuinely new question or ask any or an existing question method differently? Are you just adding visual effect without actually deepening your inquiry? That's not the trick question, right? Sometimes the honest answer is the second one, and recognizable that early is a good thing, not a failure. Now, the third point reminds you the context reminds the third point reminds you the context shapes what's even feasible. Working entirely alone is a different from working within the class, which is different again from the partnering from with a museum or archive, or if you are a dependent or a grant funding, the funder's own guidelines will shape your project too. Now the fourth one is the one I really want you to take seriously. Maintenance is a constant ongoing problem. A digital humanities project isn't finished the day it launches. Link breaks, uh, software updates change how things display, and a project with no plan or for upkeep can become unusable within just few years. Now, finally, define your project scope clearly, narrow enough that you can actually reach a finished usable state. Overly ambitious scope is one of the most common reasons digital humanities project never completed or never get completed. So one should not be over ambitious. Applications and the best practices of digital humanities. Let's bring everything together here. Since this slide is meant to consolidate the whole lecture into the practice, look at the first point here. Whenever you evaluate someone else's digital humanities project or plan your own, start with the material processing presentation framework from earlier, right? That's your diagnostic lens. Second, before starting your own project, run through the checklist we covered, your research questions, what material you actually have ethical and IP consideration, whether your question fits a quantitative or qualitative approach, and a realistic workflow plan. Now, the third is favor standard-based platform and the framework. The IIF and the linked open from scratch because standard project your sorry yes, so the third point is favor standards based platform and the framework. The IIF and the linked open data kind of approach we just discussed. Overbuilding something entirely custom from scratch because standard protects your project long-term usability and sharing potential. Fourth, document your intellectual decision throughout the process, not just your final result. Right? In digital humanities, how you got to your conclusion is often scholarly significant as the conclusion itself. And finally, the point I most want you to leave with, build ethical review into consideration or into the earliest stage of your planning, not as final box to tick once the technical work is already done. That's the difference between treating ethics and as an afterthought and treating as a part of good scholarly practice. Now, conclusion is conclusion and the key takeaway. Now, that's brings us to the end of this subunit of digital scholarship and digital scholarship and practices. Look back over the key takeaways on this slide. They tie together everything from the material processing, presentation structure to the ethical and sustainability questions that we discussed. The idea that I'd like you to leave with is that the digital humanities work is never just a technical exercise. Every processing decision and the platform choice carries real intellectual and ethical weight. In our next session, we will turn to open access sources, looking at how scholarship like the project we have discussed today actually gets shared with the wider audience. So with this, we come to an end of this lecture. I will see you in the next lecture with a new topic. Till then, thank you so much. Take care of yourself. Bye bye.